Hey everyone, welcome to Modern Sales Power Hour. I'm really pumped today to have Justin Dignelli here, founder of Pace, formerly of MongoDB and Smartling. Justin, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here.
Excellent. So while we let kind of folks trickle in here, would love to know, like, you have any big plans coming up? Any travel? Any trips?
Yeah, so one big event coming up in a couple of weeks here. I am finally having a formal wedding. So in 2020, my current wife, we did end up getting our wedding got pushed due to COVID, and we got married, did a small kind of function in the park. But we're going to do a big party with friends and family. So most of our
Amazing.
time and energy has been focused on that, although, all credit pretty much to my wife. So
Nice. Is that gonna be in New York or is that gonna be somewhere else?
yeah, so I grew up just about an hour north of New York City, and so we're gonna
Uh,
have it at my family's place. So kind of outdoor venue, praying for good weather, but yeah, it should be good.
Amazing. That sounds super awesome. Well, congratulations. Congratulations 2 times. Um,
Yes, thank you.
I had a similar situation. I think we got like City Hall married, and then we had a party like
Hmm.
6 months later or whatever. And so now we have 2 anniversaries that I have to. They conveniently I can't remember either of them, but they're on the calendar. So that's the important
Yeah,
thing.
I was just
Not
gonna
only are
ask,
they
which one do you celebrate? Because I think we have
both
to make a decision both.
obvious. No, you got to do both. Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
Embrace the and, dude.
yeah.
Wonderful. Well, so hey everyone, thanks for joining Modern Sales Power Hour. This is a really interactive format here. Would love as much audience participation as possible. So please do use the chat panel, leverage the Q&A panel, so on and so forth. For folks who haven't joined us before, so Power Hour is hosted by Modern Sales Pros. MSP is the world's largest revenue leadership community for those in sales management, sales and revenue operations, sales development, and the related disciplines. And so the community's mission is like pretty straightforward. It's to create a rich environment for our 30,000 and growing members to answer questions they'd struggle to answer on their own, and help them see around corners they may not know about, etc. Essentially, just get better. And so the way that we do that is we, through great live sessions like this here, through a robust online forum and in-person events. And so for those who haven't been, been admitted previously in, in an MSP, you should, we'll be adding you to the community now. A couple just quick reminders. So Power Hour is kind of a unique format. There's not really like a specific like set of slides that we're going to be going through or what have you. Like what we're doing is we're just kind of picking the brain of Justin, myself, etc., on kind of like key topics that are near and dear to you all's heart. And so that's why we encourage you to ask questions if you have topics that are top of mind. Both of us have been around the sales leadership block a couple of times, which is great. So people submitted some questions ahead of time. We'll kind of do some of those, and then moreover, if you have kind of things that are burning right now in your pocket, please do ask those questions. So with that, let's do some introductions here. I'll make mine super quick. I'm Pete Kazanjy. I'm the founder of MSP. I'm also the co-founder and leading GTM efforts over at HRM right now. So HRM makes data-driven sales management software. Essentially exists to help sales managers and use metrics to improve team performance. And so we think a little bit about sales math over here. We think about data-driven sales management, et cetera, et cetera. Prior to HRM, I founded a company called TalentBin that was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014, and then wrote a book on startup sales called Founding Sales. So Justin, maybe you could introduce yourselves, kind of tell folks a little bit about your sales leadership background.
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about me. I'm based in the New York City area. Right now, I am CEO and co-founder of a new startup called Pace, which is really inspired by my time at MongoDB. And the goal of our company is really to help sales teams and salespeople at enterprise software companies with a PLG motion use data to be more efficient. So understanding how their users are using the product, understanding when and why to reach out, giving them the tools to, assist the right decisions or automate some workflows. So we're really focused in that area. And prior to starting Pace, I really worked across two different enterprise software companies. Most recently, I spent 6 years at MongoDB. I joined the company when it wasn't really the sexiest time to join. It was fall of 2015. We were on our third CEO, really in the midst of a rebuild. And during my 6 years there, I think that I joined when there was maybe 250 people. When I left, there was probably closer to 3,000. We went from private to public, from probably 20 million in revenue to about 800 million. And the company's on pace to eclipse $1 billion in revenue, or maybe already has. And during my time there, I started in sales management. So I spent 3 years in sales management and moved into another role reporting into the chief product officer, and which was called the Director of Cloud Go-to-Market. Super open-ended, kind of broad title, but the purpose of that role was really our business was going from the traditional top-down selling motion and one going towards what I call a hybrid go-to-market, which is one where you have both self-service and sales and CS and other functions. And so my core role was really to work on cross-functional projects that moved us in the direction of being able to do both of those motions harmoniously. And I can talk a bunch about that. And then prior to joining MongoDB, I spent 4 years at a startup. So I got there when there's probably 15 people, left when there's about 150. Started as an individual contributor, seller, and then I eventually led the sales team there, which was 100% a SaaS offering. We tried, and I would say didn't quite succeed with some of the PLG stuff, but the experience of working at a SaaS company really in 2012 to almost 2015 really paved the way for a lot of the success I ended up having at MongoDB.
Nice, I like that. Yeah, I think that's actually really fascinating about like the cross-functional component of it, because I think one of the things that people will start realizing when they have like a product assisted motion, like either self-serve into a direct sale, or like a sales assisted motion, or certainly like a usage based motion, or like something that has very heavily land and expand behavior, like the level of like synchronicity and like alignment, like the alignment word is like such a buzzword, but like that has to happen between marketing and sales and then customer success just ends up being like astronomical. So I think we'll have a lot of stuff to dig into here. So cool. So let's go ahead and dive into our first discussion point here. Yeah, maybe you could actually just like walk through a little bit like how like self-serve to sales assist worked at Mongo, right? And kind of like talk about like how that second epoch like operated.
Yeah, sure. So when I got to the company, we had a really vibrant open source offering, right? So hundreds of millions of people were downloading the software, but it wasn't that easy to monetize. One, we didn't know who the customers were. Two, we didn't necessarily have a product that was materially differentiated from the open source offering. And so the CEO, in a very savvy move, right, kind of packaged some software, which was kind of around support, around some tooling, and that was really oriented at the Fortune 500 folks. And so it was a bit of a heavy lift of a sale. But I think the board and the executive team realized, hey, the future of MongoDB was going to be this product called MongoDB Atlas, which for those who don't know what it is, it's essentially a SaaS offering of the database across the three cloud providers. It's fully self-service, meaning there's nothing that is gated. It's pay for what you use, pay as you go. But of course, we had a team of sales and CS folks that were selling and servicing another product. So that happened in about summer 2016. And really, in some ways, yes, it was a different product, but it was almost a new business. And so from 2016 to the time I left, it was a really just kind of like a gradual transition of how we started to like blend those motions together. Because keep in mind, MongoDB was really a public company while this transition was taking place. So had to be really mindful about how we made those switches. So that was more just like setting up the context, but maybe you want to dig in on a question or two around like the evolution.
Totally. So I think, that's actually, I mean, it's really fascinating to hear that, because one of my favorite articles on, like, I mean, this notion of like sales assisted or like PLG motions, largely like it's all been done before in like open source software and like dev tools and whatever. Probably my favorite blog post on that is by David Scott. It's on JBoss. So how JBoss rose to the top. I just dropped it in the chat for everybody. But essentially, like what I'm hearing here is that you guys had like, you know, an early, like the first version of this with MongoDB was very much like the Red Hat model, like the JBoss model, where it's like packaging support, packaging documentation, you know, those sort of things, which are like, you know, makes for like a very heavy like top-down motion, right? Like or like I guess kind of Cloudera was like that a little bit before they kind of added more kind of more self-serve functionality, and then it went to something that was like more of like a SaaS-y, like actually selling the SaaS product as opposed to selling the like a services engagement or whatever around it. And so, but once that showed up, then that was like generate, like, whereas the software previously, like Mongo was previously like lead gen for this like big services business, and we would ignore all the other kind of like downloads or whatever. Now all of a sudden, like downloads and installs were, you know, they're potential leads, like they're actual like potential like people that we might care about commercially, right? Like even if they don't reach the level like the CIO of like Lockheed or something like that.
Right.
So like yeah, maybe you can like walk us through kind of how that start, like once you guys had Atlas going, and now these like installs start being potential like commercial, you know, commercial things that need to be like tended to by a salesperson, how you guys went about doing that.
Yeah, and so I think there was definitely an intentional move on the part of leadership to, you know, educate the salespeople and enable them, but to actually get them to sell a new product and run a new motion is a little bit easier said than done. And in my experience, what happened at MongoDB was I was actually running one of the teams, and so I think just given my background of working in another SaaS company, I was kind of a little bit of a renegade in trying things that were new and starting to develop these different motions. And so in some ways, like I was the incubated project, whether it was sanctioned or not. But I think, you know, if you're working at a enterprise software company, you're probably working with some open-minded folks. You know, maybe they're more junior folks, maybe they're just, you know, looking for success. But I think going to the broader enterprise sales team that was having a lot of success, they were probably a little bit less likely to change, right? Because they're making their numbers.
Like, ain't broke, don't fix it, right?
Right. And so what I think the key takeaways from, say, the first year of selling Atlas for my team, which ultimately moved into the broader org, was a few things. One, in the self-service motion, I think our comp plans were heavily incentivized on driving commits, which were really at odds with the customer. And so I think we started moving my team.
When you say a commit, you mean essentially like an annual, like an annual deal. Like, come on, you gotta like we really want to close this opportunity with a high, like with a and I'd like the number and the amount field to be like $25,000, and I would like a close date associated with it, because that makes finance happy. And I think what I'm hearing from you is the customers were like not as into that.
Right, and not even just making finance happy, like that was the way to make their number. And so the folks on the sales team would do a nice job of helping them understand the customer's requirements, maybe getting them assistance, getting them actually into a place where they were going to be successful. But they say, hey, like I'm just going to keep paying on the credit card. I don't understand why I need to make a commitment. And by the way, I think that's really the way it should be, right? But just kind of talks about how incentives were not necessarily aligned with the customer. So I think that was one big takeaway. Like we were just running the wrong motion, and we were running the playbook. You know, the traditional playbook, sales playbook that I kind of grew up with was give to get, and in some ways like introducing friction. So our team had to go through the experience of realizing, okay, we don't actually have anything that we can hold back from the customer. And so the way to win the hearts and minds of the customers to add value. And so how do I add value? And that tended to fall into two buckets. I'm probably reducing commercial friction, right? Maybe that's go through some security review, pricing review, or I'm removing technical friction. That could be through resources, that could be through support. And it was really around, if I could remove those barriers, they're likely to use more, and they're likely to spend more. And the commitment may never come, but it may come later. So I think that was another one where we started to tweak the motion a bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have a very similar, I think that there are legacy mindsets of how like enterprise software is to be sold that like are, it's almost like the motions are like 5 years to 10 years offset from how the software changes. Like, so for instance, like, when you're selling SaaS as an example, it's delivered all the time, right?
Right.
So it's not like there's like a big install that needs to happen like an on-prem situation. So like, selling on-prem, however many, 20 years ago or whatever, like, yeah, okay, you would do a 3-year, 3-year
Hmm.
contract, or like like perpetual license or whatever. But then now you have SaaS, and so SaaS is going to be being continually delivered. Well, if it's being continually delivered, like, why do I have to pay for it? Like, or commit to a year, commit to 2 years or
Right.
whatever. Now, obviously, in some situations where like the deployment of it is going to like be like heavily require a lot of like customer success or whatever, like obviously having some sort of commit makes sense there, because it's like commercially required.
Right.
Like, because otherwise, like, you're just financing a bunch of customer success salary expense or whatever, like that's not tenable to the business. But if that's not the case, right, if that's not the
Right.
case, and like they're actually like, a Slack or a MongoDB, and of course this shows up obviously in like developer tools, because like Datadog's another good example of this, right?
Hmm.
This shows up in developer tools because developers are like pretty adept at like adopting new technology, and there isn't a big CS lift versus like deploying Workday or something like that.
Right.
And now you're starting to see that show up in like what I like to call like minor use case or like thin use case business apps. So like Calendly, or like, I mean, we're on Zoom right now, right? Or like Slack, and this is not to dismiss them as like, technologies or whatever. They're just like very straightforward to use, right? Like
Right.
you, like any of us goofballs can just like start using Zoom and be okay. And so I think that there's a lot to be learned in like in the business app world from like, as people get more technically inclined, A, and then B, as like the software gets simpler for people to use. And I'll use the HRM as an example. You don't want to like artificially introduce like this friction, because all you're going to do is hurt your win rates and your deal cycles. So like
Yeah.
with us, like one of the things that we've done recently is like, one of the cool things with HRM is it takes like 5 minutes to set up. So like any sales manager or like sales operations person or whatever can literally just like OAuth in with like Salesforce, and then
Hmm.
like Atrium turns on. They've got like, a huge metrics harness. They put their team in there. It's essentially the sort of thing that like would take a sales operations person like a month to build, and then like now someone's got to pay attention to it. Because we're able to do that so quickly, we want to get them off to customer success as quickly as possible,
Right.
right? And so and we actually have like a very developed CS motion now. It's like 3 meetings, you're on your merry way, et cetera, et cetera. Ask like starting with like oh, okay, well, like we got to do a year-long contract, or we got to do,
Hmm.
we have to have a commit, versus like, yeah, you know what, you can just use this for you, like, as a manager, $6.99 a month. And when you want to convert to an annual, because
Hmm.
there's a commercial incentive, like, okay, you're going to get a 20% discount or whatever, but now you're comfortable with the fact that this changes your life and makes you a better manager. Now we can do that, as opposed
Yeah.
to like, oh, no, we really need to do that. Okay, well, if we really need a year-long contract, like I'm gonna go have to like do special favors for the CFO, and like that only works like 30% of the time. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like what you're highlighting a bit here, or the way I view it, right? When you talk about product-led growth, I there's been a lot of buzz around that, rightfully so, and I kind of view it as the e-commerceification of B2B software, right? So you kind of highlighted like you're just trying to reduce friction in as many places as possible. But I think like when it comes to enterprise software, introducing it doesn't mean that you eliminate humans from the process, right? I
yep.
think it's more about actually like the beauty of the whole PLG model is that you can grow exponentially. You can acquire customers in a much easier way,
Yep.
and therefore you potentially have much more volume. And then the question is, how do you intelligently insert people into that, now call it in product lifecycle, in a way that can positively impact, say, conversion, retention, expansion, and do that really forever, not just a one-off, right? Which is maybe more closer to the traditional model where you're just converting the customer with a big, heavy upfront lift.
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's another blog post that I really like by Gokul Rajaramam. I think that, yeah, is it Rajaramam or Rajaram? I'm trying to remember. Rajaram,
Mm.
Gokul Rajaram. He used to work at Square. I think he works at DoorDash now. He has this cool blog post called Self-Serve First, which is, I mean, he's like a former Square guy, so like, it's not surprising. Where kind of if you can solve the problem that you're trying to solve in a self-serve capacity first, that doesn't mean that there won't be salespeople involved later. What it means is that at least like you've removed friction from like the ability for someone to like, you know, at
Yeah.
Costco take a sample, be like, ooh, that actually that MongoDB is delicious.
Yes.
I think I might want some more. Now, unfortunately, like I don't think that there's like two problems associated with that. One, some problems are just like kind of intractable for self-serve, right?
Mm.
Maybe not 100%, but like essentially, like there are like use Workday as an example. Pretty hard to do Workday self-serve,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like kind
I would
of hard
agree.
to do. Yeah, or like, you know, a very substantial, but if you're like a thoughtful product manager, an entrepreneur, and you can like like you can somehow unbundle the like the big problem and some sort of like thin edge of the wedge first, then maybe you can do something there. But I think the second thing that you talk about is really great there, which is, you know, even if you have like use Atrium as an example here, we're actually like we don't have a self-serve motion, right? Like people can set up an Atrium account like without permission. Like people could just come to our website, they just sign in, they turn on Salesforce, et cetera. And then because it takes like, you know, a couple hours for the data to sync anyway, like essentially they land in a like, okay, cool, like your Atrium account is set up and like the data's pulling right now.
Mm.
Someone's going to be in touch to take you through this, right?
Right.
And so that's like where a human starts being involved. And like, would we be able to like fully automate it at some point in the future? Yeah, you know, probably. But like, I think the other thing that oftentimes people mistake is that it turns out that building software is hard and like
Mm-hmm.
requires a lot of human. And so like software engineers aren't free. In fact,
Right.
to the contrary, they're like the opposite of free. And so when you think about like self-serve motions or like self-serve products or whatever, what you're talking about is like a lot of like software engineering salary expense that's been capitalized into the product. So
Right.
oftentimes what can be cool is like having a sales assisted motion, especially if you have like a higher ASP, like use Atrium
Mm.
as an example, right? Like, you know, an Atrium seat for a manager is like $4.99 a month because it's for a manager instead of it like on a per rep basis. Then what you can do is you can introduce some of that human component as a mechanism by which to avoid engineering expense,
Right.
right?
Right.
And you spend the engineering on like exactly the thing that needs to be spent on, as opposed to like, you know, reducing frictions. Like, oh, well, can we just like throw some human at that part right there?
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think too, like one of the things that we learned, right, because we experimented and we actually ran a pilot of, okay, we want to have a sales assist function, right? And because we knew that we wanted to
This is
experiment
at
with
a
them.
this is at Mongo.
This is at MongoDB. So
Yeah.
we basically ran two pilots, right? One, and there were in some ways pilots beneath that, but one was let's have a team of sellers focus on converting free to paid users. That was one. And get compensated purely on conversion, not commitments. And the second was let's get a group of sellers to focus on growing and retaining a book of pay-as-you-go customers.
Yep.
And so we ran that for about 6 months, 2 quarters. And
Mhm.
when we went through that process, one of the big things that we learned was through the interactions of the sellers and the customers, they gathered so much interesting product feedback around friction, and actually the product managers were really interested in working with this team because they were so heavily incentivized and aligned with the customer that one of the best outputs that they had was just like really structured feedback that helped improve the product. So kind of to your point,
Mhm.
I think it's also a way to help make the product better.
Mhm. Yeah. How did that? Because I work with this lady who used to sell. She used to be a sales leader at Datadog. A woman named Michelle Pietch. I call her my PLG coach. She was at Drift, and now she's at Dooley. And so we've talked about how Datadog would go about, like the AE would close the initial deal. Usually it was like month to month. It was like this, you know, a certain number. So in Datadog's case, it's like the number of hosts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so then, you know, what they would seek to do, of course, is like add more hosts, add more servers, right? This is back in the day when it was just like Datadog didn't have like multi product or whatever. But it's like add more hosts, like add more servers, et cetera. And so importantly there, it wasn't just kind of like, oh, I'm going to test this out on one server and then I'm going to like naturally add it to a couple more, because oftentimes what would happen is there's like different services in the organization that actually have like different servers. And so it's
Mhm.
not like, it wouldn't be like it wasn't like a foregone conclusion of like just like adding those as well, because they're like supporting a different server. Or there might even be like a different like whole group of people. Like there's these servers here associated with like this, product or whatever, but now there's this other product over here and this other product over here. And like the DevOps people on this one, like they don't even like talk to the DevOps people on this one, but it's the same corporate entity. So then bridging across to those guys is actually like totally requires a human, because like these
Right.
DevOps folks don't even talk to each other. How did it sounds like that second group of folks that you're talking about, like you got people who are like pays your consumption, and now what we want to do is like identify other use cases in the in the customer. How did that team kind of go about that?
Yeah. So kind of when we ran those pilots, we learned a ton, like mainly what we were doing wrong. But I think like two interesting outcomes of that. I think kind of asking or going back to the first point you're making, which is like what was like the playbook, or what questions were these reps trying to answer? So like specifically for the folks that were doing more of the retention and expansion of pay-as-you-go customers,
Yep.
and I was kind of spearheading running this pilot, and I posed these three questions to them. I said, when you look at your group of customers, start with this. One, are they going to be a customer tomorrow? And like, how do you know that? They were managing a larger book of customers. So call it
How many unique accounts?
I probably 250 to 350. And the idea was like, how do we actually get them to do even more? Right. Just thinking about like unit economics and
Sure.
productivity. And so that was question one. How do you understand if they're like, are they going to be a customer tomorrow? And then question number two was, how do you get them to use more of what they're already using? So that could be get them over a product milestone, get them implemented faster, just get them to use more. And then the second was, can we get them to use more of other things like net new projects, net new products, net new users,
other features, whatever.
Right. And so those were the playbooks. But then the question that inevitably came up were like, great, we want to run this motion, but well, Salesforce isn't necessarily the right tool for that. So because we're not managing opportunity stages, really what we're trying to understand is what is the health of the user? What is the state of their adoption in terms of the
contact, the
funnel?
health of the contact object, health of the account object, right?
Right. So we started and we realized, okay, well, how do we do that? And we need to use data to do that. Why do we need to use data? Like, well, one, we're working with too many customers, like way more than you're used to working with.
500,000, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then by the way, these customers are changing every single day. It's like extremely dynamic. And so that's where in some ways
you can't just like, we'll ask them at the QBR. It's like, oh yeah, all 500 of them, like, and plus like that information will be out of date like 2 weeks later.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So that was one of the learnings when we had the other team. They would reach out to a customer and they would they're great, we did this, we had an issue 2 weeks ago, and maybe we helped resolved it or not, or I'm not even really interested in what you're doing. I'm just learning, like you shouldn't have reached out to me, or you don't even talk to the person that you could have potentially impacted. So that was a big question. We were saying like, how do we actually surface the right customer to the right resource at the right time? Mm-hmm. And that expanded beyond just even that sales assist motion and became even really just relevant for the entire sales and like CS org. Yeah, because think about like an enterprise company or an enterprise account manager, they're managing one customer, but it's a very large one, and they have many thousands of projects and users.
It's a bundle of to perceive it as like a monolithic thing is like a really good way. Oh, well, like I'm really good, like I have a really strong relationship with my champion. Okay, well, like what about like all these folks down here? Like, are they using? Are they getting are they getting utility out of it, etc.
Correct. And even if you have a commitment, that doesn't really mean much in the world of the usage-based world, right? So like if they've made a big commitment and they're not using it, then you need to know that. And by the way, if it's a usage-based business, the commitment is never going to perfectly align to how much they actually use. So maybe they're using way more, and there's an opportunity that you could pull into this quarter or this fiscal year that could make or break your quarter, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I talk about with folks is that like oftentimes like annual contracts can be like a little bit of like a lie, right? Because like they can like lull you into a false sense of security, like, oh yeah, we got like a whole year to get these folks successful, right? And and so oftentimes what you'll have is like people are like, oh yeah, man, this company just churned, and like you go and you look at their usage numbers or whatever, and it's like, no, they didn't churn just right now. This is when their renewal date was. They actually churned like 6 months ago. See when like everyone stopped using? That's when they gave up
Right.
on you, right? So I
Yeah.
think that like that's an important thing to be bird dogging, both from a like that's a CS learning right there. But then you got the flip side where it's like if it's usage based or like month to month or whatever,
Mhm.
bird dogging that usage the whole time in order to identify where like if there's falling off and we can intervene, or alternative, like if someone's hitting the ball out of the park and then moreover like, oh man, you're hitting the ball out of the park in this way on this feature,
Right.
you are obviously so smart and handsome and so good at this. I think we should get you good at this as well.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think at MongoDB we had a lot of those interesting opportunities on the retention side. It's pretty obvious that when, okay, say usage is going down to the right, spend is going down. And by the way, spend is a lagging indicator to the usage, right? So knowing usage is that much more important. But we would see examples where the customer spend was going up into the right, and so the salespeople or CS folks, right, in some ways they were closer to account managers, were high fiving, but in reality, they're massively over deployed. They're using the product incorrectly, and in some ways, that's just a ticking time bomb too, right? So that's like another maybe more nuanced example. And then we had multiple products and multiple features, and there were ways for us to kind of connect the dots to say, if you're doing XYZ, you're that much more likely to be interested in this other feature. And so how do we start to drive campaigns that way, or even collaborate with marketing to do sort of more, I would say, more personalized engagements with your customer, again, based on how they're using the product.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, so we're talking about like things to do that are good. What do you think is like some of the biggest errors that folks make with, PLG based motions or like self-serve? Like, what are the biggest tripwires that people stumble over when
Yeah.
trying to add a direct sales or a sales assist component to a self-serve or PLG product?
Yeah. So we talk to companies that are kind of going both directions. So from traditional sales motion to PLG,
Which is
aka
like Mongo.
right, like MongoDB, and then the other way, which is I have a vibrant self-service motion, but I want to layer in sales next. So I think they
Yep.
each kind of have their pitfalls. So on the when you're layering in self-service or PLG, one of the things I've seen and actually experienced is you want to roll out this self-service motion, and
Yep.
your initial thought is, okay, cool. What we're going to do is we're going to gate this from the salespeople, and we're really just going to let these customers self-select for as long as possible, and kind of block the salespeople from ever talking to them. And that
Huh.
may work, and that may make sense, because the idea is, okay, cool. We want customers to self-select and set themselves up
Mm.
and acquire the customer through the product. Now that implies that your product is, you can actually set it up. It's discoverable. It actually, the customer can
Yeah,
get through the end of the cycle.
I will say that feels like very, very high risky, especially when you're in a situation like when like as a software entrepreneur, like software is terrible and making
Right.
software is terrible, and it's like like users will find every way to like use the software wrong, and so the only way that you're able to figure that out is to like methodically sit with people, like use analytics, use like sit
Mhm.
with people and see like where the sharp edges are, see what they're running into, et cetera, and like no better way of doing that than with a human, because like products don't jump out of like they don't spring fully grown from like the head of
Yes.
the product manager, and so like it's almost like you're like if you're making a transition, or it's not a transition, but like if you're adding a self-servicey motion, like you're kind of like making it even harder on yourself to say, I'm
Yeah.
going to go from this all the way to this, versus like, oh no, why don't we go from here and just why don't we make our salespeople more efficient? Why don't we make sales CS more efficient? Why don't we then make this sales assisted? It's almost like a gradation, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I think, and like the compounding the error there is, cool, you may do that for a month or 2 months, and so what happens is, like, the customers don't actually convert because the product's not really workable. And then number two, the salespeople have, they're not talking to any inbound customers or any interesting customers. So you've bombed conversion, you've bombed your revenue targets, you've bombed morale, and it's a pretty tough
Mm.
one to bounce back from. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
execution risk on that, and would happy to chat with anyone who wants to talk through that. And then on the flip side of layering in sales on top of the self-service,
Yeah.
I think that one probably has a little bit less execution risk, right? Because you can pick from a wide swath of users to experiment with. I think it's more around what do you want the salespeople to do, and I think if you have a PLG motion that is able to acquire the customer, it's probably
Yeah.
less around having the salespeople do that, and it's more around driving retention and expansion of your most interesting customers. And I think the other one too is, almost every software market is wildly competitive. And so just having that account management, understanding the pulse of your larger accounts, and making sure they stay customers, right? I think that's probably an easier motion. And, you can pretty much take cues from companies like AWS. AWS is the largest PLG plus sales motion company in the world, right? Like they have and
Yeah.
I think
Probably
that's one
like
to take a cue
5,000
from.
salespeople.
Yeah,
It's like
5,000
insane.
salespeople, many millions of users, right? So I think, they're that's a good model to pull from. But I think there's a little bit less execution risk on the latter.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So I just dropped into the chat a blog post that I wrote for Lenny Rachitsky's newsletter. I cite this one a lot, but it's essentially like layering sales on a bottom-up self-serve product. I think probably the biggest errors that organizations do there is like not really kind of like related to the execution of the sales. It's more about just like not believing that you ought to have salespeople involved per se. And you know what it is? It's actually kind of like, it's like a sister problem to the one you were talking about, where it's like, I'm going to be a purist and I'm going to try to have this thing self-serve and like be a big business by itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I'm ew, I'm going to hold my nose and like, ew, I don't want to have like salespeople involved. And it's almost like, why are you making it hard on yourself, bro? Why are you making it hard on yourself? And it's kind of the same thing with like, you imagine the product manager at like, MongoDB who's like working on Atlas, and hopefully that like that failure mode that you were talking about, like actually didn't precipitate at Mongo, although, everybody makes, huge errors all the time and startups are chaos. But like, it's like, hey, I'm going to go from this enterprise thing and we're going to jump down here. Like, why would you make it hard on yourself? Right? Like, why would you not use this like tool, which is a human who are persuasive and like really good at like troubleshooting, right? And all those different things. Like, why would you fight with like two hands tied behind your back? I think that's kind of like the biggest error that I see when people like are layering sales on a self-serve product, is that they just don't. They're just like, nah, it's cool.
Yeah, and again, like you can use proof points from I look at the big three cloud providers, right? You have AWS, which was definitely more of the, self-serve first and layered in salespeople. Then you have the opposite, Microsoft, which, top down, and then they layered in the product, but like they're growing arguably the fastest. And then you have GCP, which, not to slander them, but probably somewhere in the middle.
No, they like, I mean, I think GCP, I think actually this is really good. Like I'm a huge fan of like when you have like A/B tests or like ABC tests in the market. Yeah, you might make the argument that like GCP is like so dramatically behind all the other cloud providers because they resisted having a real sales organization for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just about layering in the motions. It takes time. And to your point, if you have a wide swath of users, it's a bit easier to experiment, right? Whereas if you have a smaller group, those leads are precious and you want to make sure you monetize them through whatever channel you have, right? If you're an earlier stage company.
Yeah. There's an interesting question here by Sean. He says, we kind of talked earlier about how there's like a duality between the commit process, essentially like somebody making a commitment to buy a bunch of usage or buy a bunch of like whatever. And so what Sean is kind of asking here is like how, these both can be true, but how is it different? How do you persuade other stakeholders in the organization, whether it's like investors or board members who kind of like think about things in the old way? And like, how do you drive that education process with them, right? Like, hey guys, the customers don't want to buy this way. Like, we need to do usage based, or we need to do like month to month. Like, the world has changed. What are you talking about? I've been doing this for like 20 years. What's our pipeline look like in 12 months right now? What are you talking about? It's a 30-day sales cycle on a credit card swipe.
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts. One on the buyer behavior. So if you're in the infrastructure space and the people you sell to are also customers of AWS, Microsoft, GCP, they will be conditioned to want to pay as they go, but make commitments, which may not be the full amount that they're projected to spend, but just kind of calling out like they are conditioned to compare you to how they buy from their largest vendor. That's number
Yep.
one. And if you're not in that space, I think it's going to be similar. It's usually seat-based, which is somewhat a proxy for usage. And I think that trend will kind of continue down the path of other pieces of software, other verticals of software. Now, going back to your other question of like, how do you measure the business and how do you incentivize folks? So at MongoDB, when we rolled out Atlas, the way we kind of measured our contracts were ACV, annual contract value, and we also compensated salespeople. Right, they had $1 million, $1 million targets. ACV. Our growth models were built off sales productivity and sales capacity, and pretty much we ran the business. And I mean, I haven't been there for a year, but my hunch is it's probably still pretty similar. And we kind of shoehorned the model a little bit to take like the MRR, ARR models and translate it back into ACV. It wasn't perfect because in the usage-based models, it still fluctuates quite a bit. You kind of see that with companies like Twilio or Snowflake recently, where they may have made a commitment, but the usage doesn't reflect that. So you have to do a little bit of flexible accounting, not unethical or anything that way, but I think it's a conversation between really like your CFO and your leaders there.
Yeah, totally. Like one of our customers was a company called Trip Actions, and they have a really cool business model, right? Where they take a rake of travel spend, right? It was like very, very inexpensive to get started. I can't even remember if there's a platform fee or not, but like you can just get started with Trip Actions as an organization, and then as you buy airfare or like hotels or whatever off of through Trip Actions as an organization, they take like, I don't know, like 5% or 10% or whatever, right? So the way that the reps would be, and that was like responsible for their wild growth, because people are like, oh yeah, like why not? Like I hate Concur or whatever, like we should just try this. Now of course, and so that drove like very high win rates and compressed deal cycles. Now the problem was is that you didn't know how much they were going to spend, right? So then like how does a rep know, or how does like sales operations measure reps or whatever? And so the way that they would do it is like they had proxies, like at Trip Actions they called it travel budget under management, TBUM. It's an amazing name. And so what they would do is like on a recurring basis, like every 3 months, every 6 months or whatever, it would go back and look at like how much validated travel budget under management there was for a closed won customer, and then ultimately what proportion of that got spent. And like that was like there was like a ratio there, so that, and then that way going forward they would say, oh, okay, cool, you closed this thing for like this amount of TBUM, this is how much value is probably going to accrue to Trip Actions over time. And so that's important just for like sales compensation and kind of like motivation and what have you. So I think that that's kind of what you're talking about, is like you kind of go like this, right? Versus being like, I need you to commit to 50,000, like, because if instead what Trip Actions said was like, hey, you're going to pay me $50,000 for this software, regardless of how much travel you book through it, then people will be like, pound sand, man. Like I'm not gonna buy.
Yeah, and I think I'm kind of recollecting a few things. I think we thought about it as committed and uncommitted revenue, and revenue could really go from channel to channel. So you need to make sure you don't double count it. And then, so that's like more just like, reporting and CFO end of quarter type of stuff to like investors up. And then to your point, sales compensation is a whole nother thing. And I don't think it's perfect, but it's really, sales comp, in my opinion, is all about what are the right behaviors you want to drive and how do you incentivize those. So for the pay as you go, if you do want to be compensating sellers for pay as you go revenue, then you're probably going to have to do something where you're looking at the run rates every 90 days and annualizing that and then comparing it to the next 90 days. There's different ways to do it. It's a little bit ugly, but again, like Sean would be happy to chat with you in more detail and connect you with some other folks that were living that day in and day out.
Yeah, well, and I think the important thing there too is when we say things like it's a little ugly, or like, it's kind of like you kind of have to futz with it or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's annoying and it's not necessarily clean, but let's not forget the benefit associated with it, which is these dramatically increased win rates and dramatically compressed deal
Yes.
cycles, right? Like, so
Yeah.
it's one of those things where like the reason why we do this is because it's like it allows the market to more rapidly consume the product, which ultimately benefits us, as opposed to like, cutting your nose off to spite your face. To say like, no, 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 we need an annual contract and it needs to be like this, or else we can't, because because we haven't figured out how to model the MRR in Salesforce, and we like to report off of close one amounts on the op, and that's it. So like, so we're happy to reduce our win rate by 30% or elongate our deal cycle by 50%. So we have clean CRM. Like
Yes.
that's like the horse. That's like putting the cart before the horse, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Like the changes we made, while we may not have say moved from ACV to ARR, right? Like as a key metric, we still were driving the right behaviors, and I think that was like the key part, because driving the right behaviors was good for customers and it was good for the company.
Yeah, for sure. So I think what's interesting here is like, so MongoDB had a little, it's almost like it had like a this situation where it's like started out in enterprise land with the different service, like the services and support packaging and whatever, did Atlas, which then that had this like wonderful self-serve component to, which then like added on a sales assist motion, usage base, et cetera, et cetera. But then I imagine, had to like go back up again to like the enterprises who now needed to like adopt Atlas, right? And so
Yeah.
I think so what's kind of fascinating about that is, and you have a lot of organizations who will add or like have a self-serve motion or have a sales assist motion, and are like happy with that sales assist motion with an SMB customer or a mid-market customer or what have you. But then you have like, there's still a reality that like big organizations like to buy the way the big organizations like to buy, and oftentimes that's in conflict with how their practitioner, who may love MongoDB or HRM or whatever down here, may want to buy. And so I think there's a couple things I'd like to talk about with respect to that. Is like, one, when you've like, what were some of the best practices you've seen around that? Like, hey, you got an initial pocket of usage in champion, but now how do we get to this like massive, and that actually might be, that spend might be under the radar or what have you. How do we get up to this to like make it such that it's like a wall-to-wall situation? And then secondarily, there may be like big organizations who aren't even like using, right? Because like, might be locked down or whatever. How do we add like a pure top-down motion to what might be a successful kind of like sales assisted kind of guerrilla sales motion?
Yeah. And I think that's what I think makes MongoDB quite special, is that the enterprise muscle is really strong, right? And there's a lot of leaders that come from top enterprise software companies. But I think some of the things that you talked about, like what were the tactics that actually worked? Again, like the beauty of a PLG motion is that, anybody, whether they're at an SMB or they're an enterprise company, can spin up your product and start to use it. And that absolutely happened with enterprise customers. I think there was a little bit of surprise probably in the organization, because you thought, oh, that would never happen, but it absolutely happened. And so you get that.
We see the same thing with HRM. We have these like public companies, like some sales manager from a public company turns on like an HRM account. We're like, did Fortune 500 company name here just connect their Salesforce account to HRM?
Right.
What?
Yeah. And so I think the kind of key thing here was, okay, the number one most important thing is to make that group successful. And it's almost to put aside the idea of like generating revenue from that first use case, right? You're like, I want to make them successful. In other words,
generate stoke.
Yeah, I want to create an internal proof point that I can go champion across the org. And so once I've done that, now I'm in a position to go use that as my outbound prospecting, right? Pipeline generation. And I'm using that proof point, and I'm doing things like internal lunch and learns where I'm maybe having that team present about their success, or helping these new sets of developers or engineers, get started with some form of a use case, right? You're kind of taking that use case and you're building on top of it. And then there's kind of, once you start to get more use cases and more use cases, that should give you the ability to go even higher up to, say, some form of a C-level and say, hey, like, there's a lot of your folks using this product. Let's, get some form of an MSA in place. That means it's that much easier for others. You're probably gonna have to unblock some, again, technical and commercial blockers. But once you do that, you're then in a position to really, drive as much expansion around net new use cases as possible. And like the best reps, we're able to do that, not just at MongoDB, but other companies, right? Even at places like AWS, they're incentivized on driving new use cases. I'm just seeing a question from Sonia, which maybe is relevant. I can just read it out here. How do you hold off your sales team while you do that? What guidelines, guardrails, and practices do you put in place? So this took a while, right? Like this goes back to the even like the first example I talked about, where people were driving and over incentivizing on commitments. I think if you're trying to incentivize your sales rep to do the biggest deal possible, they may take a small use case and say, I don't really want to help you. I want to talk to the big app or the big team over here. So I think that's one. I think the second one was, and I helped kind of craft this at the company, was created a qualification framework. MongoDB specific, but I think it's probably applicable to really most infrastructure developer tools companies. You're kind of thinking about the state of the application, or right, like where is this app in the life cycle? Is it a net new one? Is it an existing one that's migrating somewhere in between? And that will kind of give you a lens in terms of like, which playbook should I use? Is it more of like a less about it's more about getting them over the line and into production and successful? Like I'm almost acting as a CS person. Or am I running more of a people-led motion, which is, hey, I need to make sure this works technically, commercially, a path to a migration? That's more of an enterprise sales motion. So we also gave them like kind of pretty clear playbooks around what to run and when and why. Otherwise, the one size fits all, which is give to get, create friction, go as big as you can, make sure you get to the C level. That's kind of at odds many times with this motion.
Yeah, I remember when I was when we first started HRM back in 2016, we did about 150 customer interviews on how organizations use data to improve team performance, and and one of the things that really stuck out was I met some of the sales management and sales operations folks at Xamarin, and they talked a lot about like really just being focused on helping people get to success. Like their SDRs weren't like SDRs; they were just kind of like support helpers, because you had all these developers, downloading a ton of like Xamarin installs or whatever, and they'd be like, "Hey, I'm here to like help you out, et cetera, et cetera," and like just to get those folks to like very like wild success on I think what might have been an inexpensive or like a free version of the product, but in order to like develop those actual product qualified leads once they were developed. And I remember kind of like talking this through, I'm like, oh yeah, that like really makes a lot of sense. And so it's like if you drive them to success, which is signified by usage and what have you, then the commercial exchange will come, as opposed to saying, oh, like you look like you're interested here, I need commercial exchange immediately and then we'll see about getting you to success.
Correct, exactly. And that look is a big flip from what most enterprise sellers are used to. But the short answer is they can adapt and evolve, and it's a combination of the right incentives, the right processes, right? Like make sure that they have the tools to do the job. And then, by the way, like, and not to just completely pitch our product, but I do think having the right tools to do the job is really critical. And so understanding the state of your customer and the users and spending time in the right place, like that builds trust with the sales team. In the absence of that, you kind of feel like you're in the dark and you don't have a seat at the table as much anymore. But with those right tools, like you're driving great customer conversations and great outcomes for the customer and the company.
Yeah. How this is part sales, but also part product marketing. But how are ways that you've seen like pricing and packaging kind of help smooth entry into into an organization. Like obviously, like usage-based pricing is a really great example of that, where it gets very low risk, but not everything can like do usage-based pricing. Have you seen like other approaches that where like the packaging and the pricing kind of helps facilitate that easy in?
Yeah. So my first thought when you said that was things maybe not to do, right? If you are running the
Sure.
self-service motion, I think sometimes it's like, hey, like sign up, like put in your credit card information, put in your payment information right away before you've seen any value. And I think that's just probably you're
Hurts
you're
conversions.
introducing friction. Exactly. I think that if you're not working with the cloud marketplace providers, you definitely should be. I think that's one of the easiest ways to reduce
Mhm,
friction, specifically with larger enterprise software companies where
mhm.
they've made $100 million plus commitments, and they're thinking about how do I draw down against that. And the marketplace is a really good way to reduce friction.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think you need to think about how your pricing and packaging is lined up around that motion. Like I'll give you an example with respect to HRM, right? Like so we're serving an unserviced customer. Like most sales managers, SDR managers, or what have you, are unsatisfied with the level of like their support with respect to metrics and analytics and what have you, because it's usually like legacy analytics, like Looker or Tableau or whatever, impossible to interpret and what have you. So we easy in enter an organization, as I mentioned earlier, through a manager or sales operations or what have you, like turning on the Atrium account, OAuth thing in, et cetera, et cetera. If we were then to price on like the number of reps who are being instrumented in the system, because like some sales operations person may come in and like put like 50 reps into Atrium because like they want to look
Hmm.
across like all 50 reps and like the mid-market team and the SMB team and the enterprise team and like the inbound SDR team and the outbound SDR team. If we were like, hey, that's really cool, man, now you owe us 30 grand, they'd be like, what?
Yeah.
Right. And like what you do is you make like a very big like bar there. And so instead, what we do is we say, oh, like, do you want to just start with like a single seat for
Yeah.
you, sales operations person? And we struggle with this internally because people will be like, whoa, we're giving away so much value if someone can like look at all these different folks, like as compared to like a single manager who is only looking at like 6 reps or 8 reps or whatever. And ultimately where we kind of came out on it was like let's just make it easy for these folks to buy.
Right.
If you give away a lot of utility, like here's this VP of sales and she buys just for herself so she can like bird dog 20 reps or whatever, like she's getting way more utility than a single sales manager with 8 reps or whatever. Oh, we should charge more. No, let's charge them the same. It's simple. The
Yeah.
mental model's okay. And then you get her to success and she's like, all right, I need this for my 6 managers, let's go. Right.
Right. Yeah. And I think one of the principles that we try to apply, and I heard, some of my friends over at Datadog, it's like, you may not want to gate things that would further the virality of your product, right? Like, so I think at
Totally.
Datadog, it's like you want everybody to be able to view those dashboards because the more people that see them, the more they want to use it and things like that. And for MongoDB too, it's just right. It's like you don't want to create friction in the developer experience that stops that app from going to production. That's not good for us. So
Yeah.
I think it's nuanced, but yeah, like one, make it really easy to purchase, and I think the marketplace is a good way. And then number two, it's like don't inhibit growth and sort of that aha moment happening amongst customers because it's overly like price inhibited.
Oh yeah, totally. Like give away like don't gate the number of like dashboards that can be broadcast into Slack.
Right. Right.
Right. Like don't do that. In fact, incentivize more. In fact, maybe have features that, that actually like drive more of that
Right.
fully. Well, hey, Justin, this was super awesome. We're out of time, unfortunately here, but as I kind of promised, the time flies because when you're geeking out on sales nerd stuff. So thank you very much for the time. Really appreciate it. For everybody else, we're going to go ahead and send out all the like links and resources that we've kind of chatted through here. And Justin, I'll see you when I'm in New York. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Have a great weekend. Bye.
All right. Bye now.